Ahoy! This is a Morgan Le Fay guide. In this guide we'll go over everything that you need to get started on Morgan Le Fay, including her abilities, ability leveling, builds, combos and more. Morgan Le Fay is a mage who is primarily played in middle lane so far, and definitely falls under the category of artillery mages. She has a lot of long range damage and poke on relatively short cooldowns, but not the same amount of super high burst that some other mages bring. She leans more towards mid to late game once her clear is online and her ult has a few points in it. Now let's talk about her abilities without going into too much detail here. Her first ability is Sigil Mastery. It's an AoE circle with two different hits, an initial hit that happens relatively quickly and a secondary hit that has a bit of delay. The first hit is in a smaller radius and deals a higher amount of damage, while the secondary hit is in a larger radius but with a lower amount of damage. Due to this ability only having a 10-second cooldown, it is her main poke as well as often her main clearing ability. Sigil Mastery has three forms that you can choose from, which apply different effects on the secondary hit or the outer ring. By default, if you just click to fire the ability, it'll use the first form, which is a 1-second fear applied to the enemy, fearing them away from the center of the circle. The second form is a slow field that lasts for 4 seconds and applies a 35% slow in the area that it's in, but if the enemy leaves the area, they immediately lose the slow. The third version will spawn a decoy that briefly follows the enemy and hits them, but gets destroyed in one hit. In order to spawn the decoy or apply the fear, you have to hit a guard with the ability. The slow field will also appear even if you don't hit a target. This ability can apply 3 different marks with each of these versions, which we'll get to a little bit later. The second ability is Dragonflight. Here Morgan Le Fay summons a dragon from the ground that knocks up enemies in a rectangle area in front of her, and then dashes forward in a line, knocking enemies back. Enemies standing in the center of this ability that are hit by both parts will be knocked up and then back. Both instances also deal separate damage. The ability starts with a 16 seconds cooldown but scales down to 12 seconds with the rank. Dragonflight can apply 1 mark. Her third ability is Shroud of Wildfire. This is a line ability that throws forward a projectile, and this projectile detonates at the end. This detonation either happens when it connects with a guard, or at the end of the ability itself, or when it hits a wall. As such, different from the one, this ability can't go through walls. If an enemy is hit by the detonation effect, a damage over time is applied to them. This lasts for 4 seconds and ticks every second, but it also applies an additional effect. If an enemy uses an escape while affected by this, they will take bonus damage. Morgan can extend this lingering effect by basic attacking the enemy that's affected by it, though the increase in duration is limited, so it's not really worth investing into attack speed for it. Additionally, this ability applies a buff to Morgan Le Fay herself, increasing her movement speed by 16 to 24% for 4 seconds after the ability is fired, and it does not have to hit an enemy for this effect to be activated. Much like her other abilities, this also applies a mark. Before we get to the ultimate, let's talk about the passive, because that plays directly into it. So these marks that Morgan Le Fay can apply to enemies last for 30 seconds on the enemy. As such, it's relatively unusual to actually have all marks up on a target. But every time a mark is applied to an enemy, the corresponding mark is also activated on Morgan Le Fay's sword. This activation is semi-permanent and increases her power by 2 plus 0.4 per level for each symbol. You can have up to 4 symbols permanently active, so you can increase your power by 40 at level 20. However, once activating the 5th and last mark, the blade becomes empowered. All 5 symbols are then activated on the sword, and the magical power buff is doubled, so up to 100 extra magical power. This effect lasts for 10 seconds and afterwards all symbols are deactivated. Additionally, activating this effect reduces her ultimate's cooldown by 10 seconds if it's currently on cooldown. If the ultimate is not on cooldown, this additional effect doesn't apply. And that brings us to the ultimate itself, Consuming Power. Consuming Power allows you to, as the name says, consume the marks that you've applied to a target. These are the ones that last for 30 seconds each, and that deals a little bit of additional damage and also increases the width of this ability. Then the ability puts you in a crowd control immune state, and you have omni movement, meaning you're not slowed if you move to the side or backwards, and you can fire 3 projectiles. Each of these projectiles deals damage and can go through multiple targets, and each of them restores missing health. If you hit multiple targets with 1 projectile, then they will restore missing health multiple times, but after the first target, the heal is reduced by 50%. The maximum duration if you're not firing all 3 shots immediately is 4 seconds, so this is also 4 seconds of crowd control immunity. Next, let's talk about the ability leveling order. While it may seem intuitive to level the 3 on level 1 since it's a line ability, it is actually very impractical to apply and it has damage over time and a longer cooldown, so that is not what you want to do in most situations. The 2 technically has the highest damage, but is very risky to use. If you find yourself in a situation where you can play up aggressively, then maybe you can use it, but realistically, in most matches, the ability that you want to level is the 1. This ability doesn't exactly have the best level 1 clear, but it works okay because of the relatively short cooldown. You just want to make sure you hit the enemy wave with the center of it, so you want to only target the front or back minions and not try to hit both, because the secondary part deals slower damage and you're going to miss the primary inner circle. On level 2, you can level the 2 or the 3, that's up to you. 3 if you want to play up a little bit more aggressively, or 2 if you want to have a little bit of safety. I personally like having a point in the 2 here, and then on level 3 you want to level whichever you haven't leveled yet. After that, you want to put another point into Sigil Mastery, and a point into your ultimate of course. From this point on, I personally prioritize Sigil Mastery over everything else, because I think that is the most interesting option. It just provides you with the best poke, safest clear and everything else at this point of the game, and I don't think there's any reason not to level it. At level 8, you can consider skipping a point if you want to, and just get a point into the 1 and the ultimate at level 9. But you can also choose to put a point into the 3, into Shroud of Wildfire, and then put your point into the ultimate, and then another point into the 1 to max it out. Now, you don't have to put a point into Shroud of Wildfire at level 8. The other option is to level Dragonflight instead. Dragonflight gets a cooldown reduction when you level it up, which is quite significant in my opinion for safety. In games where I get heavily engaged on and I feel like I can't really get too much of my damage off safely, I prioritize Dragonflight, but for overall damage output and teamfight presence, generally you want to look at Shroud of Wildfire. So in that case, your leveling would look like this. You would level up Shroud of Wildfire as fast as you can, and then start leveling Dragonflight last and put points into the ult whenever you can. While I think using the ult for damage is often not ideal, the damage increase is at least 120 base damage, if not more if you count in the marks, and you also get an increased healing along with it. So even for safety, there is benefit in leveling the ult to some degree. Now, let's have a look at the items. Now, I'm going to do this a little bit differently from other guides and give you a bit of an overview here. Please note that I'm not including tank items and bruiser items here to a larger degree. I know there is some very interesting potential with Morgan Le Fay in that regard, but that's for another video. We're focusing on damage Morgan Le Fay here. If you're going for damage, I think there are 2 starter items that are interesting for her, and that's Sense of Time and Conduit Gem. Sense of Time because both of the upgrades are really interesting for her, and Conduit Gem because Gem of Focus is really interesting for her. Generally, I'm a little bit more drawn towards Sense of Time because it has 2 different options that adjust depending on the match, whereas with Conduit Gem you're a bit more locked in, and overall for most of the game I find that Sense of Time gives you a bit more value due to the built-in CDR, whereas Conduit Gem kinda really wants you to reach level 20 to be fully effective first. The other item that you're getting along with that is pretty much always going to be Lost Artifact. That is because she burns through a lot of mana to use her kit effectively and to clear quickly, and if you don't do that, you're kinda losing a lot of her benefits. When it comes to the upgrades, you have a lot more choices though. One thing she strongly benefits from is cooldown reduction, because it allows her to clear much quicker with her 1 being used multiple times, and it also means that you can apply the fear to enemies more often, or crowd control in general more often. So I think she is a primary user for Chronos Pendant, even going so far that she is one of the guards where I would say this could be the first item that you build after boots. In terms of shoes, I prefer Shoes of the Magi for higher survivability, and most builds allow her to get cooldown reduction very easily with other items anyways, but Shoes of Focus is also a great item on her. I think Spear of the Magus is a fantastic item to increase damage against pretty much anyone, especially due to her poke nature, allowing her to hit abilities multiple times on enemies and having that effect linger for a while. Jern's Coin is generally great on most mages at the moment. I think it especially helps her as well with that little bit of extra survivability and mobility. You can build this first instead of Chronos Pendant. I've done that a fair bit. You can also build it later, depending on what you prefer really, and depending on how much emphasis you want to put on the stacks. Staff of Myrddin is another item that I think is excellent on her. The downside being that you need to use her ultimate, which is often something you don't even want to do until last second. But when you do, you can fire off a slow field and a fear right after each other, or 2 separate fears, and that is just super impactful in any fight. Soul Gem is also great, again a survivability option for her with a little bit of cooldown reduction, just all stats that she wants. And obviously when you need it, you might want to opt into Divine Ruin. In terms of upgrades, Pendulum of Ages, if you just want to have extra damage. Here you have to keep in mind that other items may have provided you with sufficient cooldown reduction already, so you have to keep a bit of an eye on the exact items that you're combining in regards to cooldown reduction. The alternate timeline has gotten quite a few buffs and I think is great for her because often she will end up being the focus of attention since she can do so much damage when she's allowed to free cast, and this just gives her a second run to try and do that again, and I think with the current state of the item, that is a viable choice if you're getting focused heavily, and if you also maybe have too much cooldown reduction otherwise. And Gem of Focus is obviously the option you're going for when building Conduit Gem. You want to make sure to have a lot of cooldown reduction from other items, so you can really min-max the effect of this. I want to give you some examples for builds and how they could look like, just some different ideas that you could work with. This is a build that is very heavily focused on early cooldown reduction with Sands of Time and Chronos Pendant on the start, and then you get a little bit more later on with Staff of Myrddin. This delays any significant percentage pen and you get your Charon's coin stacks relatively late, and this also means that you're probably not looking to go into Pendulum of Ages because you already have maxed out CDR at this point. This option here is a little bit more focused on survivability. You still get a lot of early cooldown reduction from Chronos Pendant and Soul Gem, but it takes a little longer to come online in that regard because you have Conduit Gem at the start, but then at the same time you will later on have Gem of Focus and Soul Gem for survivability, which is obviously a significant boost in terms of survivability. Then this build here is something that gives you a little bit of cooldown reduction early and gives you those Charon coin stacks as early as possible. You get some extra CDR here through the cooldown boots or cooldown shoes, so that you can have at least a decent amount of that early on, whereas otherwise you're a little bit more focused on pen and power, and then the cooldown reduction ramps up a little bit further towards the end of the build. Here you're also relatively flexible with the upgrade of sands that you're taking because you're going to sell your boots afterwards anyways, and then you can opt into something else there. This build is another option here that's just more heavily focused on damage. You don't get quite as much cooldown reduction, but you get the extra boost from Rod, which is, I think, a nice item for her as well. It's just sometimes a little bit hard to fit it into a build when she needs so many other items for cooldown reduction and survivability, in my opinion. This is most certainly not an exhaustive list though. She's very flexible when it comes to builds. You can also include more power options. Again, you can include more defense. You can include items like Soul Reaver as well. So there's a lot you can do. As long as you get cooldown reduction somehow to spam your the Fear as often as possible, you should be fine. When it comes to a playstyle, there are some things that I think are worth pointing out. First of all, she doesn't really play that much around combos. Yes, you can combo the 1 into the 3, you can combo the 2 knockback into a 1 to fear an enemy further and all that stuff, but generally speaking, she does a lot of poking from range, a lot of spamming abilities whenever they come off cooldown, dealing partial damage to the enemies. You're not that frequently going to end up in situations where you just one-shot burst someone, because that's not really how she's designed to work, but rather you will deal higher damage than most other players by poking consistently over time at ranges where they cannot reliably reach you. Your projectiles are relatively fast, they are relatively easy to apply with the exception of the 2, and you can apply them very consistently because of the relatively short cooldowns. You also have some extra movement speed in your kit to catch up to an enemy just to apply that little bit of extra damage to them. So even in teamfights, you don't necessarily want to spam your whole kit. Often it's enough to just switch between your 1 and 3 just to get some damage off consistently. And then if an enemy chooses to engage on you, you can drop your whole kit onto them. You use your 2 to knock them back, you can use your 1 to CC them further, and you can maybe use your 3 to increase mobility, or you can go into your ultimate and sustain even more and deal even more damage. It is often tempting to use the ultimate to clear up kills, and I've most certainly done it, but you have to be very aware of your positioning because often this opens a window for the enemy to engage on you. When your ultimate is up, it's significantly harder for them to attack you because they're gonna get punished with a lot of damage taken, and you're also gonna get healed a little bit. Walking the thin line between being too careful with your abilities and being overzealous with them is most certainly something that you have to learn with her to find the right balance of when you can play more aggressively or when you can't. Morgans with Bruiser builds have a lot more flexibility in that regard and can use their abilities more aggressively, but that obviously doesn't really work if you're playing her as a damage-focused mid. In modes outside of Conquest, where Bruiser build is easier to make work, I would definitely recommend that in general, because that'll allow you to play a lot more aggressively with your abilities, increasing your overall damage output in many ways, so you'll deal almost the same damage while being a lot more tanky at the same time. One last tip at the end that I almost forgot. At later stages of the game, when your cooldowns allow it, I would recommend having 4 out of 5 of the abilities stacked and not using one version of the one until you need it. This could either be the decoy or the slow, so that when you need the extra power or the cooldown reduction, you can immediately access it by using a single ability. I personally prefer keeping the slow open for this because it will have a little bit more impact in a team fight than the decoy. I hope this gave you a good idea of how to play Morgan Le Fay. If you enjoyed this and you want to see more Smite content, more info, guides and all that stuff that's coming up now, then click like and subscribe, or I will go to my garage, hide in the corner, stare at my home gym and contemplate if it's harder for me to find the time to work out or for you to find the like button. Thanks to my patrons for making this video possible. That's That Nick Walker, Drain Brennan, Lanta25 Green, Zillaria, Zed the Undead, Nevitz Jr., Rawas, Angel, Z Ferroli, and everyone else you see here.